What happens after maps stop working? At first, it feels like freedom. Boundaries dissolve. Routes multiply. Movement accelerates. But when maps stop working, direction becomes uncertain, and power begins shifting in ways few can see. London had always relied on maps. Not just land and sea, but authority, jurisdiction, and control. Borders told institutions where responsibility ended. Centers defined where decisions were made. Geography anchored finance to place. For centuries, this structure held. The certainty of location provided a foundation on which legal systems, regulatory frameworks, and accountability mechanisms were built. To understand why this changed, we must return to a moment when movement outpaced location. Capital crossed borders faster than law. Transactions spanned jurisdictions simultaneously. Decisions made in one place reshaped outcomes everywhere. The old maps still existed, but they no longer explained what was happening. The cartography of power, which had been drawn in territorial terms for centuries, was being rendered obsolete by flows that treated borders as features of the landscape rather than limits on movement. The reveal emerged when finance began behaving like a network instead of a territory. Power flowed through connections, not coordinates. Influence belonged to those who navigated relationships, timing, and alignment, not those who occupied central ground. Being everywhere mattered more than being somewhere. The shift from territorial to network power was gradual but fundamental, altering the meaning of concepts like jurisdiction, presence, and authority. As this shift took hold, traditional authorities struggled. Rules applied unevenly. Oversight lagged behind motion. Responsibility blurred across borders. When problems arose, no single place could claim ownership. The map offered no answers. The regulatory frameworks that had been designed to govern activity within defined boundaries found themselves attempting to govern activity that existed between boundaries, in the gaps and overlaps where no single authority had clear jurisdiction. London felt this tension acutely. The city remained a hub, but no longer a center that controlled outcomes. It hosted flows it could not contain. Decisions passed through faster than intervention could follow. Power was still present, but it had become mobile. This mobility changed behavior. Firms optimized for jurisdictional gaps. Risk migrated to spaces between rules. Accountability thinned as complexity grew. The system did not break, but it slipped beyond familiar reference points. The strategic exploitation of regulatory gaps was not malicious in most cases. It was rational behavior within a system that had not adapted to the conditions it was attempting to govern. London was now operating in a world where location no longer defined control. And once the map stopped explaining reality, the city would have to discover what replaced it. As maps lost authority, coordination replaced geography as a primary source of power. Decisions no longer depended on where institutions were located, but on how quickly and effectively they could align across distance. Influence flowed through networks rather than borders. This shift unsettled governance. Laws were written for places, not movements. Jurisdictions overlapped imperfectly. Each authority acted within its own limits, while finance operated across all of them at once. Gaps appeared, not from neglect, but from mismatch. The system was no longer legible in two dimensions. The mismatch between territorial governance and network finance was not a failure of either system. It was a structural incompatibility between two organizing principles that had not yet been reconciled. Firms adapted faster than states. They structure activity to remain mobile, shifting exposure where rules were lightest. Responsibility became fragmented. When losses occurred, accountability diffused across multiple locations. The map offered no single point to intervene. The fragmentation of responsibility was a natural consequence of activity that spanned multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, as each jurisdiction could claim authority over only the portion of the activity that occurred within its borders. Confidence wavered as citizens and institutions alike sensed the imbalance. Power appeared untethered. Consequences felt localized, while decisions felt distant. Trust eroded not because finance was hidden, but because it could not be pinned down. The perception that power had become mobile while accountability remained fixed created a growing sense that the system was fundamentally unfair. Efforts to restore control followed familiar patterns. Borders were reinforced. Reporting requirements expanded. Oversight intensified locally, but global movement routed around each attempt. The harder the map tried to assert relevance, the more obvious its limits became. Each unilateral effort to reassert territorial control pushed activity toward jurisdictions that had not imposed similar restrictions, producing a competitive dynamic that undermined collective governance. London confronted an uncomfortable truth. Control based on territory could not govern systems defined by flow. The city could host networks and influence their character, but it could not contain them within the boundaries of any single regulatory framework. The conflict intensified when the absence of a workable map turned coordination into strain. Networks moved quickly, but not always coherently. Decisions aligned in one region produced unintended effects elsewhere. Without a shared frame of reference, coordination risked becoming improvisation. Crises exposed a weakness immediately. When disruption spread, no authority knew where response should begin. Jurisdictions waited on one another. Networks reacted faster than governance could follow. Responsibility dissolved into motion. Everyone was involved, yet no one was clearly in charge. The absence of a clear starting point for crisis response was not merely an administrative inconvenience. It was a structural failure that delayed intervention and amplified damage. London felt this pressure from all sides. As a hub, it was expected to respond. As a node, it lacked unilateral power. Each action risked overreach. Each hesitation risked irrelevance. The city navigated a narrowing path between influence and limitation. Inside institutions, tension grew between global coordination and local accountability. Executives answered to boards rooted in place, while risks unfolded across networks without borders. Decisions were judged locally, but consequences arrived globally. Authority fractured along lines no map could draw. The internal governance of multinational institutions became a microcosm of the broader problem, as organizational structures designed for territorial operations struggled to accommodate network reality. The breaking moment came when a coordinated response failed not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Alignment existed, but without a shared structure for responsibility. Follow-through faltered. Confidence dipped. The network moved on, leaving governance behind. London confronted a difficult realization. Networks can move power, but they cannot carry accountability alone. Without a framework to anchor responsibility, coordination becomes fragile under stress. The city now faced a defining challenge. If maps no longer worked and networks were not enough, what could hold authority together in a world defined by movement? The resolution emerged through a redefinition of authority rather than an attempt to reclaim it. London learned that when maps fail and networks strain, stability depends on shared frameworks that travel with movement itself. New forms of governance began to take shape, not tied to territory, but to standards, not enforced by location, but by participation. Responsibility followed activity, not borders. Accountability became portable, carried through agreements, transparency, and mutual obligation. The portability of accountability was a key innovation, replacing the fixed checkpoints of territorial governance with embedded standards that applied wherever activity occurred. London adapted by leaning into its role as convener rather than controller. The city helped shape norms that networks could recognize wherever they moved. Influence came from shaping rules others chose to follow, not from commanding space they could bypass. This shift restored coherence. Coordination gained structure. Networks gained accountability. Authority reassembled, not in one place, but across many, aligned by shared expectation rather than enforced boundary. The lesson was clear. When maps stop working, power does not disappear. It relocates into relationships, standards, and trust that can move as fast as finance itself. Control gives way to coherence. London moved forward not as the center of the map, but as one of the architects of what replaced it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.